Benzaguru Pema CD Hong. O Nga Hung Benzaguru Pema CD Hong. O Nga Hung Benzaguru Pema CD Hong. Hello everyone, and welcome to my Sunday Dharma talk here at the Buddha Center, Sunday 2 p.m. Second Life time. As you can see, I have overcome my graphics card problems at a cost of $400, and I have a brand new graphics card and fans, so we should be good for a while. There's my personal information for those of you who may be interested. So today we're going to continue on with our series of talks on the long suttas of the Majjhima Nikaya. Today is the Upali Sutta, the conversation with Upali. It's a lengthy sutta, but I didn't have much difficulty boiling it down to its essence. So it's not going to take as long as an hour to go through. It's probably going to take us about half an hour, at which point I'd like to invite you to retire with me to the new location of the previously Dharma by the tracks, now rechristened Dharma by the river, in the X-teen grid in Yarmouth, Y-A-R-M-O-U-T-H. Actually, I don't have the specific coordinates, however, if you just use the map and go directly to Yarmouth, you'll be on the street immediately in front of the entrance to the new Dharma by the river location. So I invite you all to join me afterwards to have an continuing open Dharma chat this evening and see the new place. So let's begin with, this is Majjhima Nikaya 56, the 56th sutta, called the Upali Sutta. The location of this sutta is Nalanda in Magadha, of course. We're familiar with these places now from our series of talks on the Digha Nikaya. Near Rajagaha in Pavarika's mango grove. The Pali name for Mahavira, the guide, or Titankara, I think is the Pali word, of the Jains, who lived about the same time as the Buddha, is Nataputta, the Jains themselves being referred to as naked ascetics, or Nigantas. The sutta tells us that Mahavira, and henceforth I'll use the more familiar terms Mahavira and Jain or Jainism rather than the somewhat obscure Pali terms, is staying at Nalanda with a large gathering of Jains, similar in fact to the Buddha. One of these, Digha Tapasi by name, visits the Buddha after alms round. After exchanging pleasantries, the Buddha invites him to sit. The Buddha proceeds to quiz Digha Tapasi about the teachings of Mahavira. The Buddha asks him, quote, "How many kinds of action does the Niganta Nataputta describe for the performance of evil action, for the perpetration of evil action?" Unquote. A vexed question, to be sure. Nataputta's reply is even more obscure. Quote, "Friend Gotama, the Niganta Nataputta is not accustomed to use the description action, action. The Niganta Nataputta is accustomed to use the description rod, rod," quote unquote. Bodhi opines that the Jains, quote, "the Jains regarded bodily, verbal, and mental activity as instruments by which the individual torments himself or herself by prolonging his bondage in samsara and torments others by causing them harm," unquote. The rod being an instrument of punishment, as in the English idiom, "spare the rod, spoil the child." Not a metaphor which is not unfamiliar to English speakers. The Buddha reformulates what appears to be a semantic distinction to how many kinds of rod does Mahavira describe. Tapasi's answer is that Mahavira teaches 3 kinds of rod, body, speech, and mind. And in Vajrayana, these are called the 3 Vajras, mysteries in Tendai and Shingon, but perhaps not surprising in view of other talks, are found explicitly formulated in the Pali Canon as the 3 primary karmic factors, which we've encountered before, of course, body, speech, and mind. Familiar structure in the Pali Canon. The point is that Mahavira recognizes body and speech as independent karmic causal factors in addition to mind. This of course contradicts the Buddhist view that intention alone causes karma and leads to a completely different view of the path that leads to inaction and self-mortification specifically. So this dialogue is in the context of course, the Buddha's repudiation of asceticism, or at least extreme asceticism. This sutta is another demonstration of the Buddha's dialectical method. The Buddha asks Tapasi which of the three Mahavira considers to be the, quote, most reprehensible for the performance of evil action, unquote, to which Tapasi replies that Mahavira considers the bodily road to be most reprehensible. Tapasi then asks the Buddha which rod he considers most reprehensible. The Buddha replies that he does not use the description rod, but rather uses the description of action, thus inverting the original conversation, and perhaps also making explicit that the conversation is about, specifically the law of karma. He replies that he also considers each of the three kinds of action to be independent of each other, but with mental action as the most reprehensible, and indeed, as we know from elsewhere, the essential causal factor. Thus, the Buddha distinguishes his teaching from that of Mahavira in two aspects. First, the use of the term action rather than rod, and second, that mental instead of physical action is the most reprehensible. Bodhi suggests that mental action may refer to volition or intention as the root of karma, but, he says, the commentary identifies mental action with wrong view. Tapasi then goes to visit Mahavira, possibly in or near Balaka, thus dating the sutta prior to the death of Mahavira, Namaskardar, about 425 BCE. These dates vary from scholar to scholar, but that's one I picked up from Wikipedia. Somewhat before the death of the Buddha himself, between 411 and 383 BCE. And we've already encountered, of course, Mahavira in Digha Nikaya 29 in our series of talks on the Digha Nikaya, where Walsh observes that, contrary to many, perhaps even most modern scholars, the Digha Nikaya places the death of Mahavira prior to the death of the Buddha. And we also find this in the present sutta as well. Just as this, as we shall see, just as the Buddha was interested in what Mahavira thought, so Mahavira is interested in the teachings of the Buddha. And in fact, it does seem that Jainism and Buddhism were the two primary contenders at that time, and the two ones that survived. The other schools of that time don't really seem to the other heterodox schools of that time don't really seem to have survived to the present time. But of course, Jainism and Buddhism both continue on today. Mahavira praises Tapasi's explanation of Mahavira's teachings and declares that the mental rod is insignificant compared with the bodily rod, the precise opposite view to that of the Buddha. Hence the emphasis in Jainism, of course, on bodily asceticism, as contrasted with the emphasis of the Buddha on mental discipline, primarily. Upali, Mahavira's foremost disciple, declares that, and that incidentally, that picture behind me and to my left is a picture of Mahavira. Upali, Mahavira's foremost disciple, declares that he will go to the Buddha and defeat him in argument on this point. But Tapasi warns him that, quote, the recluse Gautama is a magician and knows a converting magic by which he converts disciples of other sectarians, unquote. One is reminded of the Buddha's reason for rejecting the cultivation or demonstration of psychic powers. Mahavira dismisses this objection, however, and encourages Upali to go and refute the Buddha's doctrine. He even suggests that the Buddha might be converted to Jainism. Upali goes to see the Buddha. The Buddha declares that, quote, if you will debate on the basis of truth, we might have some conversation about this, unquote, thus establishing the proper basis for any discussion of Buddhist or indeed of spiritual doctrines. The Buddha, although the Buddha does make quite clear in the Pali Canon that ultimate realization is beyond ratiocination, reasoning, rationality, it is still possible to arrive at truth through an analytical approach to the doctrines. Nonetheless, reason will not suffice to take one all the way to realization. But it's clear that the Buddhas, as I've emphasized throughout these talks, the Buddha emphasized wisdom and the cultivation of wisdom above all else. Upali agrees. Elsewhere, the Buddha emphasized common ground in constructive dialogue. The Buddha presents Upali with a scenario. Suppose, the Buddha says, a Jain were sick and needed cold water to survive. However, Jainism prohibits the use of cold water because it might contain living organisms, a distinction that we now know to be false, both hot and cold water containing living organisms. This again shows the emphasis of Jainism on physical action and observance. Nevertheless, he longs for the cold water that would save his life. Thus, he keeps his vows physically and verbally, but he violates them mentally. In what state, the Buddha asks, would he be reborn? Upali replies that he would be reborn among the, quote, mind-bound devas, as he is still attached in mind, but not in body or speech, unquote. The Buddha replies that Upali has contradicted himself, presumably because the Jain's rebirth is determined exclusively by his mental attachment. Thus, his mental attachment is more important than his lack of physical attachment. Nevertheless, Upali reasserts his original statement that physical action is the most reprehensible. Next, the Buddha forces Upali to admit that Mahavira teaches that non-volitional infractions of moral law are not demeritorious. As in Buddhism, it's the same view in Buddhism as well. If you step on an ant in the street by accident, there is no negative karma incurred. The Buddha then asks Upali which rod willing appertains to. Upali is forced to admit that it appertains to the mental rod, once again proving the Buddha's point. Nevertheless, Upali reasserts his original statement that physical action is the most reprehensible. The next argument of the Buddha refers to the notion of psychic powers. He asks Upali whether a man with a sword could kill off the inhabitants of Nalanda, the town where they were at the time, single-handedly. Upali agrees that such a notion is absurd. But, says the Buddha, could a recluse or a Brahmin with supernormal power and attained to mastery of mind, quote-unquote, do so by, quote, an act of hate, unquote? This is, of course, exactly the situation of the great Tibetan saint Milarepa, who started his quest as an evil sorcerer. Upali agreed that he could. The Buddha points out that, therefore, the mental rod is greater and more powerful than the physical rod, once again contradicting Upali's original position. Nevertheless, Upali reasserts his original statement that physical action is the most reprehensible. Next, similar to the previous point, the Buddha reminds Upali that, according to tradition, the Dandaka, Kalinga, Majjhima and Matanga forests became forests by means of the mental act of hate on the part of the seers. Obviously, a Vedic legend or tradition of which I have no specific familiarity, but once again also showing that the Buddha's acquaintance with Vedic lore. And if anyone has any better knowledge of Brahmanism than I have and knows the story behind that story, then I would be happy to learn it. The foregoing establishes quite clearly that the Pali Canon clearly asserts the reality of psychic, supernormal, or magical powers. The Buddha reminds Upali that he agreed to debate on the basis of truth, yet every answer he gives contradicts his original position. Upali admits that he agreed with the Buddha from the very first example, yet he continued to oppose him in order to, quote, hear the Blessed One's varied solutions to the problem, unquote. Whereupon he takes refuge in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha for life as a lay follower. The Buddha exhorts Upali to investigate thoroughly, householder, to, quote, investigate thoroughly, householder. It is good for such well-known people like you to investigate thoroughly, unquote. Thus, reiterating his emphasis on rational distinctions. Upali contrasts the Buddha's commitment to inquiry with the attitude of other sectarians, thus clearly distinguishing Buddhism from sectarianism. The Buddha even advises Upali to continue to give alms to the Jains, based on his long association with them. Once again, Upali praises the Buddha for recommending that Upali give gifts to others, and not only to the Buddha and his followers. Once again, the Buddha emphasizes his basically non-sectarian attitude to the Dharma. The Buddha gives Upali a progressive instruction on giving, virtue, the heavens, that is, higher dimensions of reality, the danger of sensual pleasures, and the blessing of renunciation. That is, a general religious talk, as we have seen elsewhere, followed by a special teaching on the Four Noble Truths, corresponding to what we've identified elsewhere in other talks as the Dharma in brief. Quote, the spotless, immaculate vision of the Dhamma arose in, unquote, Upali, and he realized the universality of arising and cessation. Immediately he became a stream entrant. Returning home, Upali advises his doorkeeper to no longer admit Jains to his home because he has become a follower of the Buddha. If they need alms, however, they should wait, and alms will be brought to them at the door. Tapasi heard that Upali has converted to the Buddha Dharma, which he reports to Mahavira. Mahavira doesn't believe it and asks Tapasi to go to Upali's home to verify that this is true, which he does. Mahavira still does not believe it and goes to Upali's home himself, together with a large number of his followers, and asks to see Upali, who meets with them in his home in the hall of the central door, quote-unquote, perhaps some sort of antechamber or parlor. Whereas before Upali would give Mahavira the best seat, today Upali himself takes the best seat, to Mahavira's chagrin. Mahavira becomes abusive and accuses Upali of insanity, having been caught up in the Buddha's, quote, a net of doctrine, unquote, and converted by his, quote, converting magic, unquote. Upali does not deny this, but rather praises the Buddha's converting magic. Bodhi notes that Upali is referring specifically to his attainment of stream entry. Upali replies by means of a parable that, quote, the doctrine of the foolish Jains will give delight to fools, but not to the wise, and it will not withstand testing or being smoothened out, unquote, comparing Mahavira's teachings to a monkey. On the other hand, Upali says that, quote, the doctrine of that blessed one, accomplished and fully enlightened, will give delight to the wise, but not to fools, and it will withstand testing and being smoothened out, unquote, comparing the teachings of the Buddha to a pair of new garments. Mahavira points out that Upali is known to the king and the Jain congregation as a follower of Mahavira, and asks him whose follower he should now be considered to be. I find that reference interesting to the king, as though the king were keeping track of the different affiliations of the sammanas, perhaps alluding to some kind of social practice at the time that's been the details of which have been lost. Upali's response is curious, in that it implies that he is wearing robes. Perhaps he is wearing the white robes of a lay follower of the Buddha. I do not know. In any case, Upali definitely did not become a monastic. He was still a householder. It also seems to imply the presence of the Buddha, since the text says that he, quote, extended his hands in reverential salutation in the direction of the Blessed One, unquote, perhaps indicating the direction where the Blessed One was staying. Again, a speculation on my part, since there's no other indication that the Buddha is present in the house. And he recites a poem in praise of the Buddha in response to Mahavira's question, which he compares to a heap of flowers. That is, the poem is compared to a heap of many different kinds of flowers being strung along a garland, as I recall. Upali praises the Buddha using many epithets, including the Wise One, the Blessed One, the Illuminator, the Hero, the Best of Seers, the Noble One, the Tathagata, the Sublime One, and the Enlightened One. The poem compares the task of the Arhat to that of a soldier, in keeping with the Buddha's Kshatriya caste. He is the victor in battle, the excellent leader, the leader of the herd, elephant-like. However, most of all, the Buddha is described by his psychological qualities. He is undiluted, unperplexed, confident, sorrowless, content, aware, insightful, skillful, and able, punning on the Shakyan family name from which the Buddha comes, which, as we've discussed in previous talk, means able. Conversant, balanced, honest, humble, unworldly, ethical, wise, should I have repeated wise? Maybe not. Free, quiet, restrained, happy, beyond any possibility of temptation or vice, independent, fearless, completely self-possessed, retired, and dispassionate. Above all, he is the Tathagata who has liberated and freed himself from the inveiglements of rebirth. The Buddha is explicitly affirmed to have gained the triple knowledge, that is, the knowledge of the Vedas that underlies Brahmanism. And you'll recall in previous talks how the Buddha has indicated or identified his Dharma with the original Dharma of the Vedic rishis, which has been long forgotten by the Brahmins. One can discern a broad development in the stanzas of the poem, beginning with the wise one whose knowledge is perfect. As such, he is the leader, the bull elephant, especially in the realm of religion, wherein he has achieved the apex of realization, characterized as dispassionate wisdom and freedom from involuntary rebirth, or samsara, of course. Quoting the last stanza of the poem, most worthy of gifts, most mighty of spirits, most perfect of persons, beyond estimation, the greatest in grandeur, attained the peak of glory, the blessed one is he, and I am his disciple, unquote. This poem causes Mahavira to vomit hot blood and be carried away to Pava on a litter, where he dies, thus dating the Sutta to about 425 BCE, as stated at the start. And of course, you'll recall that the other Sutta I mentioned, Digha Nikaya 29, I think it was, reports that the Mahavira has just recently died, again, at Pava. So these two suttas obviously are associated, or should be associated together. And they both indicate that Mahavira died in Pava prior to the death of the Buddha himself, sometime prior to the death of the Buddha himself. Perhaps a decade or so prior to, or maybe a little longer, before the death of the Buddha. Okay, that completes the Upali Sutta. As I said, it's a short one today. Next week we're going to do Sutta 60 of the Majjhima Nikaya, called the Apanaka Sutta. As you know, of course, we're doing only the suttas in the Majjhima Nikaya, which are at least as long or longer than the average length of the suttas in the Digha Nikaya, as a kind of supplement to the Digha Nikaya. Okay, so before we conclude with the dedication of merit, whereby we dedicate the merit of this talk to all beings, does anyone have any questions, comments, or discussion concerning any of that? While you're thinking about that, I'll just pull up dedication of merit. For those of you who came late, that picture behind me on the left is actually Mahavira, not the Buddha. I pointed that out at the beginning. Okay, it seems like no one has any questions. I do have note cards of this talk. For anyone who would like one, please IM me after the talk. And as I mentioned at the beginning, Dharma by the Tracks is now renamed Dharma by the River and has been relocated to Yarmouth, Sim, in the X-Teen grid. So after this talk, I'll be going there. If anyone would like to join me for an open Dharma chat this evening, you are welcome to do so. Please join with me in the dedication of merit, whereby we dedicate the merit of this talk to all beings. Whatever understanding, whatever positive force has come from this, may it go deeper and deeper and act as a cause to reach enlightenment for the benefit of all. Thank you once again for this opportunity to discuss Dharma. It is my pleasure and privilege. Until next Sunday at 2 p.m., Namaskar.